Welcome. You are tuned in to the 2020 Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy Annual Policy Breakfast. I'm Alejandra Serna-Rios, Director of the Center. I'm so excited you have made it time for us today and to bring you a great program. So for those of you who are new to the Center and our work, please listen closely as first Senator Dan Johnson of Lewiston will talk about the role of the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy and the value he finds in the work we do. After that, Center Advisory Board member Sue Lovelace sits down for a fireside chat with Representative Ilana Rubal of Boise to reflect on some of the key legislative issues of recent years. Then I'll jump back on to discuss where our economy could be headed, what we've experienced in these long months, and what tax and revenue topics we're likely to see in the upcoming legislative session. And at the end, Center Advisory Board member Todd Achilles will discuss how you can stay involved with the Center. So before I utter another word, I have many people to thank for their contributions to the Center. Our work isn't possible without the wise input and guidance from the Center's Advisory Board, and two of our Advisory Board members are joining us on this broadcast later today. Our work owes much also to our tireless parent organization, Janus Inc., which is supporting many community-based nonprofits in Idaho. And I want to thank Janus co-directors Karen Tucker and Stephanie Bender-Kitts, as well as the Janus Board of Directors. We couldn't have the impact we have without your generous contributions. It's supporters like you who keep us independent, nonpartisan, and unapologetically focused on the facts. First Interstate Bank is sponsoring this year's policy breakfast, and I want to thank them for their generosity. So normally we would have this breakfast for our closest followers who are you, or perhaps you were invited to this event by someone you know and want to learn more about the Center. And because this is an event we usually do for our closest followers, I want to introduce myself as well formally for the first time since coming on as director in January. So I've been with the Center as an analyst and then as policy director for 4 years. I cut my teeth in policy analysis in Austin, Texas, where I grew up and also attended the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. I would also like to introduce our staff, Kendra Knighton and Kirsten Pokup, who won't be able to join us today, but whose work you see in and out throughout the year. Finally, as we approach the end of the year and you're perhaps thinking of ways to support the Center, I never want to make it hard for you to do that. So you can make a gift here on the Give Butter platform or on our webpage at idahocfp.org, or you can contact Penny Traylor at ptraylor@janus.org or reach out to me. So stay tuned, and once again, thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Dan Johnson. I serve in the Idaho State Senate from Legislative District 6, Nez Perce and Lewis counties. I have followed the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy since becoming a member of the Idaho State Senate in 2012. I've been interested in their work and their independent, nonpartisan review of policy issues, especially on education and taxes. I have found their work to be complete and timely. I've created a separate folder within my State House email system to keep and track communications from the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy. I access this folder for quick reference on key policy issues. I've grown to appreciate the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy and the transparency of their work. I agree with them that important policy decisions should be made out in the open. I have referenced and made use of their work both during the legislative session and in the interim period. I appreciate knowing they're available to help me with important policy questions throughout the year. During the 2018 legislative session, I was serving as chairman of the Senate Local Government and Taxation Committee. The Senate committee was considering important legislation on changes to income tax rates at that time. I requested the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy to do an analysis on an alternative income tax legislation, which they readily agreed. I was very much appreciative of their analysis It was helpful in my decision that year on tax policy. I will continue to ask for policy reviews from the professionals at the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy during my legislative tenure. Alejandra and the staff have been great to work with. They are accessible, respectful, and professional, and I know I can count on them in the future to give me unbiased, nonpartisan information to help me make informed and better decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Johnson, for your kind words about the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy. Welcome. I'm Sue Lovelace, Advisory Board Member for the Center. I'm joined today by Idaho State Representative Ilana Rubel for a fireside chat about key state fiscal issues we're facing. Representative Rubel has served since 2013, including membership on the House Health and Welfare, Resources and Conservation, and Transportation Committees. As House Minority Leader and with her legal background, she commands knowledge about the full range of state policy issues. Thank you for joining us today, Representative.
Thanks for having me.
So clearly, we are in an unprecedented year full of challenges, particularly on the fiscal side. Let's dive into some of those. Our state and our lives have been upended by the coronavirus pandemic. We're currently experiencing an uptick in cases once again. Tell us some of what you have heard from lawmakers about the right balance between economic activity and public health.
Well, certainly the pressure among my colleagues, of course, you know, that we're in a state that is very heavily GOP, and I think the leaning among my majority party colleagues is that they want everything open. Very much. They were very opposed to there being any shutdowns whatsoever. They wanted everything open as soon as possible and to remain open. So I think there's very little appetite right now to pursue any shutdowns. I think the debate right now is whether there should even be mask mandates, because there's certainly a strong pushback about that. So I think there's, you know, the camp that thinks everything should be open, but with masks and distancing, and then the other camp is everything should be open, no holds barred. In terms of the outlook on our economics, it's an interesting situation because there was this sense that we were heading into this major, fiscal crisis where we all had to do this belt tightening. Every agency was forced to do a 5% cutback by the governor, which has caused some real pain, I think, to the vital operations of agencies. It now looks like we're running a surplus, and we've been running a surplus every month for 4 months. So some of us are really starting to question whether the justification is there for this really severe austerity. There had been a proposal to cut $99 million from our education budget. And when we're running a surplus, and we have $600 million in the rainy day fund, you know, and running above our projections for the year, I think it really begs the question of, does it make sense to be forcing these really dramatic 5% cuts across the board? And frankly, is it even legal to do so? Because the statute on point only allows the governor to deviate from the legislative approved budget when there is a projected shortfall and not when there's a projected surplus. So those are some of the questions I'm having, is whether there really is a justification for this, you know, extreme belt tightening we're seeing, which is causing some pain, I think, across government services.
Mm-hmm. So is there more that leaders could be doing in your mind?
Oh, absolutely. You know, we have not spent most of the COVID funds that were given to us by the federal government. We received, you know, $1.25 billion. One area, for example, is in childcare providers. Our childcare providers are facing a severe crisis, and projected that within a year, 80% of them would be out of business from the loss of business and the added expense that they faced from trying to function during COVID times. There was $21 million earmarked for childcare providers in the COVID funds. Last I checked, about $5 billion of that had been dispensed. So there's a lot more we could be doing in terms of just giving out the money that was earmarked for areas where the money is desperately needed and it just hasn't been dispersed. And so I would really hate to see all of our childcare providers go out of business when there's still $15 million that was intended for their relief that hasn't been handed out. So there are a number of areas like that where I think, you know, the money is there and it just needs to be sent to the places where it's needed. Food banks, housing relief, there are a lot of areas like that where we have tons of money, frankly, from the COVID funds. The need is great, and it's just not getting out there.
Gotcha. So we're in a recession driven by a pandemic. Unlike the Great Recession, there's more revenue available to policymakers, relatively speaking, to address those effects. At the same time, the center found this week that months after Idaho reopened, Idahoans are still experiencing significant income loss and difficulty covering basic expenses. What is important for policymakers to keep in mind in that context?
Yeah, I think it's important for them to remain in touch with the very real needs of families. You know, when this first began, and when the governor first started having ideas about how to spend some of this COVID relief money, the first thing that came to mind was relief for businesses, and I think $300 million was earmarked toward relief for businesses. And that's all well and good, but there was very little discussion given at the outset to how to help the people at the bottom who were losing their homes, who couldn't feed their families. And we really had to start those conversations that initially were nowhere part of the discussion about what do we do about people being evicted? What do we do about homeless shelters? What do we do about the food banks that are folding because the demand on their stores are so great? So we've really been working to try to introduce that to the conversation as well, and not just have it all be about business stimulus, but about how do we make sure those vital social safety net services, which are being strained to breaking point, are also tapping into these COVID relief funds. So I think that's something we really need to keep in mind, because those groups don't tend to have highly paid lobbyists. Those groups tend to not get their message out necessarily as effectively at the Capitol as perhaps IACI does.
Thank you. So what could the change in leadership in Washington mean for further relief state budgets and Idaho's economy?
Well, it's an interesting question, because with gridlock, you know, I think there was a hope that now we would finally see another round, perhaps, of stimulus funds to help bolster our economy before we do spin into a recession. I think the hope was that we would have COVID much more under control by now, but now this third spike seems to be eclipsing the first two, and I fear it was at 120,000 new cases yesterday. So we seem to have crossed a really bad line where it's really spiraling out of control, and I worry that, you know, the first $3 trillion we spent are not going to be sending us on to a recovery as we had hoped, because people didn't necessarily behave quite the way they needed to in order to put an end to the pandemic. So I think we are going to need more COVID relief funds. But I anticipate if we have divided government with Democrats in control of the White House, but Mitch McConnell continuing to run the Senate, I'm not sure what the prospects are for meaningful stimulus relief. We shall see, but it looks very different now than it would have, I think, if the Democrats had taken control of Congress as well as the White House.
Gotcha. So tax policy drives the resources we have to invest in long-term economic growth strategies, such as public schools, transportation, health. Tell us a little bit about how tax policy comes together, or doesn't, in a typical year.
Well, here I just want to put in a good word for the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy, because people just don't pay attention to tax policy the way they need to. If you ask anybody, and I've knocked on 10,000 plus doors in my time in the legislature, everybody says their top issue is education. Everybody cares about education. Everybody wants good schools. But people are nowhere to be found when bills come before the House Revenue and Taxation Committee, which is really the starting point for these taxation bills. And that's really where the rubber meets the road. And we see these bills go through. There was what I viewed as a really damaging bill that went through in 2018, the top margin tax cut that went through, that it was really a revenue cut that's taken over $200 million a year out of our state funding, has made it really impossible for us ever to meaningfully fund our schools, and for us ever to scrape ourselves up off of being 51st in the nation on school funding. But once that's passed, then all the lawmakers shrug their shoulders and say, oh, well, money's all gone, can't fund schools, I guess. So what we really need are those folks who care about education funding to be watching in that House Revenue and Taxation Committee when those tax bills come through. Because, you know, you could have heard a pin drop in there. Nobody was in there complaining about $200 million being taken out of education funding, because it's kind of a wonky, obscure issue. I don't know if anybody really fully understands the extent to which taking $200,000 out of our revenue pot is inevitably going to very powerfully impact our ability to fund education. But that's where it all starts. All revenue bills have to start on the House side. And once again, there's a really outsized influence that well-moneyed business lobbies have in there. They have full-time lobbyists who fully understand the ins and outs of revenue and taxation policy. They're pushing for the tax cuts. And then, once the money's gone, it's very hard to claw back, and then the money's gone and you can't spend it on paying your teachers, and you can't spend it on necessary programs for the schools. So I love that about the Center for Fiscal Policy, is that you help everybody understand that, and that extremely vital connection between making sure we have money coming in the door so that we have money to fund our schools.
So can you walk us through what the policy-making process has been like with the issue of rising property taxes?
Yeah, that's a big one. And, we all headed into the last session, to the 2020 section. People were up in arms about their property taxes. People had seen their property taxes go through the roof and were very concerned. And, everybody heading in thought that the biggest issue of the session was going to be how reducing people's property taxes and how are we going to do that. And yet somehow we came out of the session without a single bill that provided any reduction of property taxes. The reason for that, and, I'm the Democratic House leader. We had 6 different bills addressed to reduce property taxes, and we couldn't get a single one of them heard or addressed. And if I had to distill the debate there, some of the things that we were bringing, restoring the indexed homeowners exemption. Again, kind of a wonky issue. I don't know if people realize that the indexed homeowners exemption was stripped away in 2016 by the legislature. That's really when your property taxes started to go up. That's, pretty much in the last 3 or 4 years is when everyone saw their taxes go through the roof, because removing that index exemption shifted millions and millions and millions in property taxes away from the commercial sector onto the residential sector, onto your home, onto your house taxes. So we were trying to restore that. Couldn't get a hearing on it, couldn't get a vote on it. We wanted to increase the circuit breaker, which is a tax break for seniors and those with disabilities, low-income folks with disabilities who really need that tax break. Most people on fixed incomes. Couldn't get a hearing on that. We tried to get one on using impact fees to pay for new schools, so that when you have these large new developments that are so big they require a new school, you actually would build that into the developer impact fees instead of taxing everybody else in the entire district to build that new school. We had a broad range of ideas that were all designed to reduce property taxes while actually maintaining the vital services that we need, because that's the catch that you run into here. If you just cut county budgets, the counties do a lot of very vital things that we want them to keep doing. They run a sheriff's department, they run a jail, they run a public defender, a prosecutor, and a DMV, and a public health department, and a lot of really important things that, we really don't want to just chop out. So we were trying to find ways to maintain vital services while reducing people's property taxes. On the other side of the equation, there was a big move afoot that just said, chop all the county budgets. Just pull $42 million. That was the bill that came forth out of the House. Just cut $42 million out of county budgets. And the House Democrats, as well as the Senate, said, that doesn't seem like a very good idea, particularly in a pandemic, taking, the county governments are the ones who are on the front lines. They're the ones running the paramedics and the public health districts and a lot of the most vital services that you really need in a pandemic. So we said, in the middle of a pandemic, taking $42 million away from paramedics and public health districts seems like a bad idea. So I was fortunate that effort failed. But then there we were at the end of session with all efforts by all sides having failed and nothing happening on property taxes. But going forward, I would certainly like to see us exploring options that really thread the needle of getting property taxes reduced while not jeopardizing the vital services we all rely on from our counties and local governments.
Yeah, great explanation. So let's turn to discussing some of the big budget questions on the table. Of course, our big budget item, K-12 school funding. So when you came into the legislature in 2014, budget cuts to schools were in effect. The Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy found that it took 5 more years after that until school funding, that's the state dollars on a per student basis, came back to pre-recession levels. What are some of the things you observed and you heard from educators, families, and others about the effects of that over time?
Yeah, we had really cut ourselves into a crisis after the last recession. There had been just bone deep cuts to the public school budgets. Teachers hadn't seen a raise in eons, and we were really, in a dire crisis. Largely in the area of recruiting and retaining quality teachers, but really across the board. I mean, we had, and frankly, some of this crisis persists. We had a large number of districts across the state who had to cut down to a 4-day school week because they literally didn't have the money to keep the lights on 4 days a week. We had, districts that were moving to online phys ed, districts that were eliminating, art and music programs and history programs, and that offered no AP whatsoever. And we were just losing teachers hand over fist. And we were so far below all of our neighboring states, it was embarrassing. When I first came in, our starting salary for public school teachers was $31,000. Every state around us was 38 or more. Some were 38, 43. I mean, they were all dramatically above us. We did do the teacher career ladder, which was a 5-year scaled increase in salaries, which was desperately needed. Of course, our neighboring states have as well, so we're still below our neighboring states, but at least now we're closer to the 40,000 level for starting salaries and not looking at 31,000, which was a joke. We just could not find people to work for that. But we still, frankly, we're not just competing with other states, we're competing with other professions. As I mentioned, I've knocked an awful lot of doors, and I can't tell you how many people I've met who were former public school teachers who are now dental assistants, who are now realtors, who are now simply not working at all because it just, they either could make so much more money in any other profession, or if their spouse made enough money, it just wasn't worth working at all for the pittance they were earning as a public school teacher. So we continue to have those problems, but it's a little less severe than it was before we did the career ladder. But we continue to have the problem. We're still dramatically underfunding education. We're still 51st in the nation on funding per student. But this dovetails with what I was just talking about on the property tax problem, because basically it devolved into a situation where the state told people, hey, you want to decently fund schools? You want, teachers that are paid enough to stick around so you can actually attract talented, experienced teachers? Fine, pass a levy, pass a bond, tax yourselves on a local level. And a lot of us have, and now 80% of the school districts across the state are now keeping things functioning, often with as much as 1/3 of their budget coming from property taxes. And this is part of why we're hearing the outcry and people are so unhappy about the property taxes, is because instead of schools being funded on a uniform level out of the state general fund, it's going district by district, and people are paying through the nose on their property tax bill to do it. This presents a variety of problems. First of all, I don't know how sustainable it is, because you got to pass those bonds on a 2/3 majority. When people are unhappy about their property taxes, they may not vote for those anymore. And then where will we be when 1/3 of our school taxes drop out because people are unwilling to continue passing those property taxes? Another big problem that you encounter, though, is that you see an incredible disparity between wealthy districts and less wealthy districts. The districts, thankfully, like Boise, that always pass these bonds and levies, we have terrific schools. My kids have gone through Boise schools. They're wonderful. We have the best teachers in the world. They're great. But other parts of the state that don't pass those additions to their property taxes are really underfunded, and there's just no comparison in what they can offer their students. And that is, I think, is a great tragedy, because those are the parts of the state, those students are the ones who need a great public school education the most. These are the kids that are coming from very low income families. These are the kids that are coming from families where their parents may not have gone to college, may not even have graduated from high school, communities of color, communities that are just facing a lot of socioeconomic disadvantages. And now I feel like our system is layering on more disadvantages by giving them a subpar public education in those regions, while the best education is to be had in the wealthier areas. So I think it's a really big institutional problem that we have right now that stems at its core from the fact that the state is not funding education on a statewide level out of the general fund like they should be, and they're punting it down onto local property taxpayers.
Got it. So briefly, can you talk a minute about vouchers? That's a question we're starting to get. What about vouchers?
Yeah, this is a very real concern, and I'm so glad that your watchers are going to be attuned to this. So we already have, as I said, some serious issues with education funding in Idaho. Can't emphasize enough, 51st in the country, not good, relying in huge part on these property taxes. But I'm really worried that we're in danger of the situation getting much worse. The reason for that is that the Supreme Court, in its last term, which, and I think this was after we left session, it was in April or May, but they issued an opinion striking down something called the Blaine Amendment. Now, let me back up a little bit on that. So in Idaho, there's actually been pretty substantial appetite in our legislature, which, as I mentioned, is very right-leaning, for years to institute a voucher program, which would allow you to say, hey, you know what, I don't want to send my kid to public school, so I'm just going to take the $8,000 that the government would have spent on having my kid in public school, and I'm just going to take it and give it to Bishop Kelly or to my local private school and have my kid go there instead. And this has the effect of sucking a large amount of money out of the funding available for public schools. Now, this has been illegal up till now because under Idaho's constitution, it has something called the Blaine Amendment, which says that you cannot use any public funding toward a private religious school. So in our constitution, we had an absolute ban on voucherizing public school dollars and taking those public funds out of the public school system and sending it over into the private school system. The Supreme Court struck those down across the nation. There were more than 30 states that had amendments like that in their constitutions. Those are all now null and void under the Supreme Court's ruling. It was, I think, a 5-4, conservative versus liberal breakdown in the Supreme Court that came out. As soon as that came down, my colleagues, most of my GOP colleagues, were ecstatic and were sending messages around on the email saying, "This is great. The door has opened. We're going to bring vouchers to Idaho." So that is coming. And again, this presents the specter of millions and millions of dollars being removed from our public school budget so that people can take that money out and use it to send their kid to a private school instead, which really is a risk of substantial defunding of our already very underfunded education system. So be on the lookout for that. It's coming, and I think it has really dire consequences, and it's gonna take some vocal citizen engagement to keep the money that we do have for public schools protected.
Well, the Senator appreciates the heads up. That's something we could be looking at. Kind of last major topic, I guess, criminal justice. The Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy found last year that Idaho has the fastest growing incarceration rates among our neighboring states. One of the consequences of that is that the criminal justice budget is taking a larger piece of the pie today. Are we headed in the right direction or not, and why?
Well, thank you. This is a topic very near and dear to my heart. I've been trying to work for years on criminal justice reform. I do not think we are moving in the right direction on this. We are the leading incarcerator in the West. Our corrections budget is the budget that ate New York. It really is. When last year, when they were telling every agency that they had to cut their budgets by 2%, this is before COVID even hit, the exception was corrections that increased theirs by 19%. And it's getting worse and worse. We've now overflowed the Idaho prisons and sending them to for-profit, out-of-state prisons across the country. Lots of reasons that's bad. Not only is it costly, but it has terrible outcomes. I mean, the recidivism rate is much higher when you take people thousands of miles away from their family and friends, where they can't get visitors, where they feel completely disconnected, where their connections to their community get broken, so they have fewer options to re-enter successfully at the end of their incarceration. So I'm certainly not a fan of this shipping people to Arizona and Texas and everywhere else. But one of the things I'd really like to see us do, and that has been a passion project of mine for years, is to eliminate our mandatory minimum sentencing laws. Idaho's laws on this point are costly, and I think they are irrational. Right now in Idaho, almost any offense that you commit, a judge has discretion and can look at the particulars of the case to say, oh, well, this person is a hardened criminal and should go away for 10 years, whereas this person was a dumb kid who just made a first-time mistake and maybe probation is good enough for them. They have that latitude on everything, including very serious, kidnapping, rape, terrible offenses. But they don't have that discretion on drug possession. If you are found with 2 grams of heroin on you, doesn't matter if you're 18 years old, straight A student, never had an offense in your life, the judge has no option but to lock you up for 5 years, no possibility of parole. And judges hate this. I've seen them on the record say they think it's a travesty. It's costing us a lot of money, millions and millions. We have about 12 million a year just in those mandatory sentences who are overwhelmingly nonviolent. 83% of those folks are nonviolent offenders, have never had a violent offense. 91% of them are first-time traffickers. So certainly for a lot of reasons, I think it's certainly a humanitarian disaster, but it's also a fiscal disaster. And frankly, we are worsening the outcomes for those people for the rest of their lives. We are probably reducing their earning potential and their likelihood of being successful long-term law-abiding citizens. Because it turns out when you take an 18-year-old and you lock them up for 5 years, you've created a criminal out of somebody that probably could have been rehabilitated and spent a lot of money doing it. So I would really, really like to see us, and I brought this bill, it's passed with a supermajority through the House repeatedly, but they just won't allow it a hearing or a vote in the Senate. So there's a lot of room for improvement there, but I think it would be fiscally much more sensible for us to be fixing our system to focus on rehabilitation and drug treatment as opposed to these very long mandatory sentences that we see now.
Well, Alana, I could ask you questions all day. I should call you Representative Rubel, but as my neighbor, I think of you as Alana, as well as a star leader in our legislature. And I really want to thank you for making yourself available to take on this fireside chat. And next, we're going to hear from our Center Director, Alejandra Serna-Rios, about the impact of state policy choices and fiscal issues to come in the next legislative session. So stick with us.
Thank you, Sue and Alana, for your illuminating discussion. For those of you just joining us, I'm Alejandra Serna-Rios, the Director of the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy. Our state has faced tremendous challenges this year from the COVID-19 pandemic and the recession that has followed. But this year has shown us not really how a virus can drive economies, but how policy responses, including at the local, state, and federal level, have determined how we've weathered this and where we are headed. And we wouldn't be a fiscal center if we didn't focus on the dollar side of the pandemic story, which is what I'm going to get into. Our state's fiscal story quietly began changing in January and February as states around us started experiencing more intense impacts from the pandemic unfolding. But it was the events over the course of just 1 week in late March that set up much of the story that we've been living. On Friday, March 20th, the legislature in Idaho adjourned with a set of limited state responses to the pandemic, moving $2 million into an emergency fund for the governor, and allowing the governor to tap reserves if needed to backfill the budget year that was ending 3 months after that. Reserves that stood at that time at around $400 million. A couple of days later, on March 25th, when our state declared a stay-at-home order to attempt to halt the spread, many businesses shuttered. People saw reduced hours or were outright laid off. And 2 days later, on March 27th, Congress passed the CARES Act. We didn't know at the time it would be the last major federal fiscal response to the economic challenges of the pandemic. We did know at that time that it was an extraordinarily complex piece of legislation that interacted with state fiscal policies in a serious way. So the center sprang into action to make sense of the federal package and to ensure that the executive branch had the right analysis and information to approach the legislation. The legislature had left. There was an extraordinary sense of urgency to respond. There was an extraordinary, a lot of things we didn't know about how the virus was transmitted at the time, how it could be treated, and therefore what our future would look like. And on top of that, there was almost complete novelty in the new programs that came through in the CARES Act. So the first week of April, the center issued an analysis and made 4 values-based recommendations to the governor to guide a reopening and a recovery. These would prove salient not only to our immediate fiscal challenges, but they have formed a framework for us at the center for how to think about the recovery as we head into the next legislative session. One was to maximize the CARES Act programs to address fiscal as well as health needs. 2 was to create a transparent process for spending $1.25 billion in federal state fiscal relief that came to Idaho. 3 was to direct aid to people most impacted by the pandemic, as well as job and income loss. And 4, it was to tap state reserves to address revenue shortfalls. So I'll describe each one a little more and talk about what's taken shape since then. So 1, on maximizing federal CARES programs. CARES created new federal programs and also expanded existing ones in different ways. And it was critical for Idaho to understand where those choice points in policy were and how to make key decisions about maximizing those federal programs. So for example, unemployment benefits were very slow to get into the pockets of newly jobless Idahoans. New benefit programs through CARES included the $600 federal enhancement to unemployment benefits and new benefits for new categories of workers who previously would not have qualified for unemployment. So we recommended, because of that enhanced outreach on these benefits with updated information on the timing, when they would be available and when new categories of workers could begin to apply and receive benefits. And we also pointed to other structural barriers in Idaho's unemployment insurance system. We provided the data that showed that state benefits replace on average just 42% of a newly jobless Idahoan's previous wages. We also found that state benefits are short in duration with, in comparison with other states at around 20 weeks at the time. This data was from lawmakers who were hearing from constituents. And as UI benefits stalled, job and income loss began to become widespread. In particular, food insecurity grew, and it was critical for the state to look at its options in the SNAP program, otherwise known as Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly known as food stamps. Idaho took up an option of extending maximum SNAP benefit levels for the months of April and May. And we showed how supplemental SNAP indeed was. So the average Idahoan received around $100 in benefits, which meant that on average about $1.20 went to every meal for the average person enrolled from SNAP. We showed that by extending an enhanced maximum benefit level in SNAP, about 60% of households in Idaho would feel, the impact of this choice, and that it added between about $150 to $200 per month through this change. So far, Idaho has continued to renew this critical support based on this information and ensured that more Idahoans have more access to food. Finally, small business aid from the federal Paycheck Protection Program was distributed in inequitable ways in Idaho. So we told the story of how this was taking effect in a segment for Idaho Matters on radio in advance of the creation of a state version of the program that had a few more sideboards in place to guide direct aid to the small businesses that were most impacted. Next, a transparent process for spending $125 billion in federal relief in Idaho. So aside from new or expanded federal programs, the federal government gave every state a special one-time pot of money to use toward any state-specific responses to the pandemic. Idaho's federally funded Coronavirus Relief Fund sat at $1.25 billion. And the check arrived after the legislature had departed. Had they been in session, they would have held hearings and produced bills to allocate these dollars based on information, based on pros and cons. But there was no process or vehicle for the governor's office alone to make decisions on such a grand scale outside of this regular process. And at the center, we believe that policy decisions should be made in a transparent way, that it should be done out in the open. So we recommended to the executive office and the budget chief that they create a process. So shortly after, an advisory group was created to oversee the allocation of these dollars through public meetings, consideration of public shared proposals. The committee also documents allocations down to the payment level in service of transparency as well. So although evaluating the impact of all these decisions may take a long time, there was yet another principle that was critical to lift up as these initiatives were created and rolled out. And that is recommendation 3, to direct aid to people most impacted by the pandemic and the recession. Idaho's federally funded coronavirus relief fund of $1.25 billion didn't have many strings attached. Beyond the requirement that our state expend our dollars by December of this year, there was not much more. So the center lifted up the need to direct those dollars that the state had control over to the people who were most impacted. So early in the spring, those were folks whose businesses shuttered and people who were laid off or saw their hours reduced. And when it came to the governor's initiatives funded through these dollars, we took a closer look and added data and analysis where it was needed. We crunched the numbers on how job and income loss was risking eviction for some families. Data that came before the governor's advisory committee when they considered and approved a new rental assistance program. The governor used those $1.25 billion in different ways that carried needed dollars out to impacted people. That included a small business grant program, a stipend for families with children in school, and other direct assistance. And when it came to using those dollars to fund a one-time $1,500 bonus program for people who had been laid off, we lifted up ways that policymakers could take that concept further and make it a permanent part of the tax system. Like 29 other states, Idaho could do this by creating a state tax credit for middle-class families who are working. So number 4, tapping state reserves to address revenue gaps. I'll fill this in a little bit because so much has changed in this area, but at one time we believed that revenue could drop as much as 15% in Idaho, based on what happened, what we analyzed as what happened during the Great Recession. This would have caused immediate and sharp cuts to schools and other areas of the budget. And while the governor had been given authority to use rainy day funds in the current budget year, that year ended last June, and there was no such authority for the budget year that we're in now. It's really hard to overstate the uncertainty that hung over the budgets just a couple of months ago. And what added haziness to the whole process was uncertainty about whether we could use the $1.25 billion to backfill revenue losses. So revenue has come in stronger than anticipated this year, but it doesn't mean by any means that we're out of the woods in terms of protecting critical services that are funded through public dollars. And there's definitely compelling reasons to keep our eye on revenue trends. So in the event packet you received in advance of today, we can know a few things about where we stand today as a state. You can find 2 of our latest analyses there that reveal the picture of a state and of communities and people in a fragile economic recovery. All in all, we found that federal aid to Idaho through CARES topped $9 billion in Idaho, including those new and expanded federal programs, the $1.25 billion in state fiscal relief that came to Idaho. So in a state with a general fund of about $4 billion, $9 billion has played a very big role in floating revenue. And it's done this by sending dollars to people who were struggling with loss of income or shuttering businesses, and having those Idahoans spend those dollars right away, consistently in a way that creates demand for goods and services, directed tax revenue to the state. So we've come in better than anyone thought for that reason. The center also found, however, in sharp contrast, that months after Idaho reopened its economy, Idahoans are still struggling and experiencing fairly widespread hardship. We have mined data from a new specialized census survey that's collecting data in practically real time about the pandemics. And those data show us that half of families with incomes below $35,000 in Idaho have lost income since March, and that 1/4 of them expect to lose more income between now and the end of the year. Nearly half of these modestly earning households are having trouble covering basic expenses, including food and other core things, as do 1/4 of middle-class families. And while the sample sizes on these data don't allow us to draw conclusions on the exact impact on Idahoans of color, we know from national data that it is Black, Hispanic and Latino, Native, and other people of color who are more likely to experience the worst of the pandemic and the recession's effects. And while no income group has come away unscathed, the effects of this are less pronounced for higher earning households. So it's critical to understand the ways in which people and communities have been impacted. There's a lot of uncertainty about whether federal aid will once again be there to ease the recession. And as Representative Rubel pointed out, the dynamics in Washington may stymie further relief packages. So it's more important than ever for policymakers to make informed choices about how to use our state's public dollars that respond to these realities. So as I mentioned before, I stepped into the role of the center early in January, and the experience of leading in these times has only emphasized that the need when it comes to fiscal policy is to lead with values as well as clear policy thinking, facts, and sound analysis. So that's what I think about now that we're gearing up for a legislative session that will truly be like no other. So here's a preview of the issues we expect to come in the next session. So taking a step back to what seems like many ages ago to this year's legislative session, lawmakers came into the State House with a goal to address rising property taxes. Many homeowners have seen their property tax bills go up in recent years, but in particular, this issue puts strain on modest earning homeowners in areas where the costs of growth are absorbed by folks who are already living in that community. So Idaho has a program that addresses this issue for a small subgroup of those homeowners, the Circuit Breaker program, which provides a credit on property taxes for modest earning homeowners. So that's about $30,000 more or less for people who are over 65, for disabled Idahoans and others for whom property taxes consume an outsized portion of their income. So that circuit breaker credit has lost much of its value over the past 2 decades, something that the center found data. So as housing prices have skyrocketed from housing booms in different communities in Idaho, that's meant that the circuit breaker covers much less of a property tax bill for the average recipient than it used to. So formerly, just in 2006, it would cover about 60% of a tax bill, and today it covers over, so today it covers just 60%, whereas before it covered over 80% of the average recipient's tax bill. So this leaves fixed income seniors to foot a bill that they can't absorb, and causing them to have to leave their home in most severe cases. So we shared our analysis in a feature story in the Idaho Statesman over the summer when an interim legislative committee on property taxes has been meeting. Updating the circuit breaker is fiscally prudent at around $5 million, but it feels like we have yet to decide whether preserving fairness for low-income senior homeowners is truly a priority. So moving to other tax revenue and budget issues, there's definitely a need for the center's independent data and analysis rooted in these common sense values. The CARES Act of March of this year included a new federal tax change, and this change prompts Idaho to carve out the same tax change in the state tax code, something that it would do beginning in January if lawmakers approve in Idaho. So the tax change isn't of a particular response to anything related to the pandemic, but if approved, it could create a state tax break for businesses that could take as much as $150, $170 million out of the revenue system permanently in Idaho. So at a time of widespread hardship and urgent needs, is it a fair way to allocate precious public dollars? Is it the most effective way to generate demand and pick up activity in the local economy? We know that investments in schools and post-secondary education lead to higher wages for Idahoans, and that our state lags in terms of creating a workforce that attracts a wide array of businesses. Dollars removed from revenue means there are fewer resources for schools, roads, and other services. In 2018, just a couple of years ago, through a reduction on the top individual and corporate tax rates, we took millions out of the revenue system at that time. So how do these tax changes impact our ability to invest and recover? We will analyze tax proposals and bring the data and analysis to bear on these questions. Lastly, all eyes are on a fund that has collected all the sales tax from out-of-state retailers at a time when many people are turning online to buy stuff that they normally didn't used to. So Idaho's Tax Relief Fund has collected around $100 million and by law must be used to reduce the tax responsibility of Idahoans. So what is the fairest way to allocate these dollars in a pandemic? Who gains and what is equitable? We will bring data and analysis to bear as well on these questions. And this year we have a well-researched answer. A state earned income tax credit could route those dollars to Idahoans who work but experience low income or earnings. So this potential credit, which 29 other states have created, rewards increased hours, increased earnings, and could reach many of the essential workers and people who have been most impacted by the pandemic. Sending these dollars to everyday Idahoans means more demand for household expenses, driving economic activity, and boosting our recovery. In combination with other features of our tax code, such as the child tax credit, the grocery credit, and others, the state earned income tax credit reflects both a fiscally prudent direction and an equitable approach to state taxation. Well, that's as much as I'm going to cover with you today. I want to thank you once again for joining us and for your support, and encourage you to reach out to me about any questions about the work that we're doing and any suggestions you have. I want to thank once again First Interstate Bank for being our event sponsor. And stay tuned for another of the wise brains associated with the center, Todd Achilles, Center Advisory Board member. He has a message for you on how to stay involved with our work. So thank you once again, and take care.
Thank you, Alejandra, for your leadership of the center. A great discussion with Representative Rubel, and thank you, Senator Johnson, for sharing your thoughts. We appreciate your leadership. My name is Todd Achilles. I've been a member of the board of the center for 4 years. I've drawn a bit of the short straw here in terms of asking for folks to make a contribution to the center after the costliest election in US history. But I'm going to tell you why that's a great investment. I lead a TV broadcasting company in Boise, but I also teach a class at a graduate level in public policy analysis. And here's what I'll tell you about public policy analysis. It's hard. Good, enduring public policy requires a lot of hard work. You combine facts and data with rigorous analysis that withstands the partisan scrutiny and helps electeds and the public look past their personal biases. Now, the flip side of this is easy. If you want to push a narrow issue that you don't care about partisanship, hire some lobbyists, get a law firm, pay them $500 an hour, and have them craft whatever you want. And here's why the center's work is so important. While corporations and dark money groups are advocating policies that further their narrow self-interest, who speaks for Idaho families? The center delivers independent, rigorous policy analysis for the hundreds of thousands of middle-class homeowners as the weight of property taxes falls ever heavier on their shoulders. And the center delivers independent, rigorous policy analysis for 300,000 kids in our public schools as state funding is cut and local taxes or local levies become a bigger and bigger burden. And the center delivers that independent, rigorous policy analysis on how best to distribute federal COVID stimulus, and so that we do it in a way that enhances long-term growth and helps low-wage workers succeed. And the center is always one of the first with rigorous policy analysis when a bill comes to the legislature that impacts state budgets. Now, the good news is the center doesn't charge $500 an hour. The center doesn't pick its clients based on their share price or annual revenues. And the center doesn't use out-of-state profits to influence Idaho politics. The Senator is literally one of the few organizations that analyzes tax policy with everyday Idahoans in mind. And we all want an Idaho that is equitable and where the burdens of good government are applied equally. So please support the Center with a contribution today. You can give at www.idahocfp.org. Go to the website. If you've already given, we appreciate it. Based on what you've heard today, we would hope you consider doubling that contribution. And again, the link, IdahoCFP.org. I'm listening for the keyboards as folks are opening the browser and going to this URL. We do have some good news today. There's a match. So there's a $15,000 dollar for dollar match. So if you can contribute today, that'll be matched by one of our donors. And if there's another way that you want to give, please give Penny Trailer a call at the center. And if you want to do stocks or something out of a trust, she can help arrange that for you. So let's give the center the resources they need to be that thoughtful, trusted voice for Idaho government. And that makes a difference for Idaho families. Thank you.